Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. We're going to be taking a listener request and doing a deep dive on the 2019 Dayton shooting.
Oh yeah, this one was a tough one.
It really was, and we're going to try to go way beyond just, the headlines
Yeah.
and really dig into what happened, what led up to it, and the aftermath and everything.
Yeah, unpack it all.
Yeah, so picture this August 4th, 2019. It's a little after 1:00 a.m. It's a Saturday night.
Summer night,
Summer night, yeah, warm people are out, enjoying themselves in Dayton, Ohio.
the Oregon District.
The Oregon Historic District. Yeah, this place is known for its, lively bars and restaurants, and it was packed, especially outside this one bar called Ned Pepper's Bar.
Right, and this is where everything changes.
Yeah, in just 30 seconds, everything changes.
It's just chilling how quickly a scene of, celebration
Yeah.
can turn into just absolute terror. A man 24 years old, Connor Betts, opens fire with a modified AR-15 style pistol.
Oh, wow.
And, this is the kind that's designed for maximum damage. He had a 100-round drum magazine, so, he could fire a lot of bullets without having to stop and reload.
It's hard to even imagine that chaos.
Yeah.
The sources mention 41 rounds, fired 9 people dead, and 27 more injured.
In just 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's a lot of lives shattered in just half a minute. And to make it even more, disturbing, one of those killed was Bet's own younger sister.
Yeah. What does that tell us about what was going on in his head, right?
Yeah, like what could lead to that?
It really underscores the complexity of this case.
Yeah.
But one thing is for sure, the police response was incredibly fast.
They were right there.
They were already in the district, and they engaged Betts within 20 seconds of those first shots.
Wow.
10 seconds later, he was dead.
So if they stopped him that quickly, why was the death toll so high?
That's a great question, and it comes down to just the sheer firepower that Betts had.
Yeah.
And the element of surprise. Even with those swift actions, the damage was already done. And in the aftermath, the big question, as always with these mass shootings, is why?
Right, of course.
Why did this happen?
Yeah, and the sources talk about the FBI investigation, which was extensive. They wrapped it up in 2021. Did they ever actually figure out a clear motive?
So this is where it gets really interesting and honestly more disturbing. They uncovered a lot about Betts' background, painting a picture of a deeply troubled individual.
Going way back.
Going all the way back to high school classmates, describe him creating hit lists and rape lists targeting other students.
Wow.
There are even reports that he was bullied and had talked about carrying out a school shooting.
So this wasn't just like, edgy teenager stuff. This was serious.
No, this wasn't just idle threats. He was actually suspended for this stuff.
And that sends chills down my spine. If there were so many warning signs back then, why wasn't anything done to prevent this later on?
It's one of the most difficult questions this case raises. It highlights the complexities of mental health issues and the challenges of intervention. Beth's ex-girlfriend also shared some really disturbing insights. She said he struggled with dark thoughts, hallucinations, a fear of developing schizophrenia.
It's almost like he was a ticking time bomb. Did his family or friends try to get him help?
The sources don't go into a lot of detail about whether he received professional help or not,
Yeah.
but his ex-girlfriend's accounts really make you think about the internal struggles that he must have been going through.
Yeah, and you mentioned the FBI investigation. What did they find when they searched his home after the shooting?
What they found was a fascination with violence and mass shootings. There were materials suggesting he'd been thinking about committing this kind of act for at least a decade.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't a sudden impulsive decision. It seems like there's a long and disturbing buildup to this.
So we have this troubled young man obsessed with violence. Did he have any specific targets? Did he hate a certain group of people? Was there any political or racial motivation?
That's what makes this case even more unsettling, even with all of that investigation. No clear motive was established. We know Betts considered himself a leftist. He even expressed support for Antifa online.
Oh, so that's where some people might have jumped to a conclusion.
Right, and which led some to speculate about a political motive.
But that theory didn't hold up.
Not quite. The FBI couldn't find a direct link between his political views and the shooting. They explored every angle they looked into. Whether he intentionally killed his sister, they considered possible ties to incel groups,
Yeah.
Those online communities known for misogyny and violence, but nothing concrete emerged.
Okay, so if it wasn't politics and it wasn't targeted hatred, what was it? What could possibly drive someone to do something so horrific?
That's the million-dollar question, and sadly one that we may never have a definitive answer to. The lack of a clear motive makes this tragedy all the more baffling and, in a way, even scarier.
It certainly adds to the sense of helplessness. This wasn't some,
Right.
ideological extremist. This was a deeply troubled individual who, despite showing red flags for years, was able to slip through the cracks and the consequences were devastating. Yeah.
Exactly. It challenges us to look closer at the systems we have in place. How we identify and support individuals who might be at risk, how we address mental health issues in our society, and how we prevent those who shouldn't have access to firearms from getting them.
Right. It's a lot to unpack. This isn't just about one horrific night in Dayton. It's about the bigger picture, the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. But before we get into those larger conversations, I want to go back to that night in the Oregon district. The sources mentioned the victims. Can you tell us more about them? Who were the people whose lives were cut short that night?
It's heartbreaking to go through the list.
Yeah.
The youngest was just 25, the oldest 57. It was such a mix of people, students from the nearby university, artists, a mother of two. They were just out enjoying a Saturday night when they were caught in this nightmare.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what their families went through and are still going through. The sources mentioned that Betts had extra magazines on him and was wearing body armor. It sounds like he wasn't just planning to hurt people, he was prepared for a fight.
Absolutely. It suggests he was expecting resistance, that he might have even wanted to engage in a shootout with police. It's a level of premeditation that is just chilling.
Yeah, this wasn't a random act of violence. This was meticulously planned. Speaking of planning, where did he even get that kind of firepower? Can anyone just walk into a store and buy a modified AR-15 with a 100-round magazine?
So the sources say he actually bought the gun legally. He ordered it online from Texas and then had it transferred to a local gun dealer in Ohio where he picked it up.
So, even with all the talk about gun control, there are still ways for someone like Betts with a history of red flags to get their hands on these weapons of war. It's a sobering thought.
It certainly highlights the challenges of crafting effective gun control legislation.
Yeah.
The system failed to prevent this tragedy, and it makes you wonder what more could have been done, what warning signs were missed or ignored.
It's a question a lot of people were asking in the aftermath, but even in the midst of all the grief and anger, there was also an incredible outpouring of support for the victims and the community.
Absolutely. It's often in the darkest of times that we see the best of humanity. People organized vigils in the Oregon district. They lined up to donate blood. Local businesses offered free meals to first responders and those affected by the shooting. It was a powerful reminder that even in the face of such tragedy, there's still so much love and compassion in the world.
Yeah, it's good to hear that, to know that even amidst such horror, people came together to support each other. But this wasn't just a local story. The Dayton shooting made headlines around the world.
It did, and it sparked a lot of international debate. The sources mentioned several countries: Japan, Uruguay, Venezuela, issuing travel warnings to their citizens about the risks of traveling to the U.S. They called it a gun society.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. It makes you think about how America is perceived on the global stage. Is this violence, this access to firearms, something that defines us in the eyes of the world?
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But these travel warnings certainly highlight the international concern about gun violence in America. It begs the question, how much do these tragedies affect our standing in the world, our relationships with other countries?
It's a question worth pondering. This event didn't just impact Dayton, it rippled outwards, affecting how other nations view us. But let's zoom back in for a minute. You mentioned that the police response was incredibly fast. Can you unpack that a bit more? What were the officers' actions like in those critical seconds?
The sources describe the police response as heroic. They were already patrolling the Oregon district that night, just a block away when the shooting started. Within seconds, they were engaging Betts, and within 30 seconds, he was neutralized. Their training and quick thinking undoubtedly saved lives.
It's a testament to their bravery and professionalism. They ran towards danger, putting themselves in harm's way to protect others. But sadly, even with their quick response, there were still casualties from the police gunfire itself. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so two of the victims were actually hit by police gunfire. The chaos and confusion of that moment, people running, screaming the darkness. It's a tragic illustration of how even in a justified shooting, there can be unintended consequences.
It's a stark reminder of how complex and difficult these situations are, the split-second decisions that officers have to make under immense pressure. And it adds another layer of tragedy to an already horrific event. Did the sources mention anything about the emotional toll this took on the first responders? I mean, witnessing something like that has to have a lasting impact.
You're right. It's not just the physical dangers they face, but also the psychological trauma. The sources do highlight that mental health professionals were brought in to help the officers cope with what they had seen and experienced they had to process the trauma of that night. Not just the violence, but also the knowledge that their own actions, however justified, resulted in additional casualties.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that first responders are human too. They have emotions, they carry burdens, they need support, just like anyone else. It's easy to focus on the physical aftermath of a tragedy like this, but the invisible wounds are just as real.
Absolutely. Trauma can manifest in so many ways. Anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, strained relationships. It's essential to provide first responders with the resources they need to heal and process these experiences. And it's not just the first responders who are affected. Think about the families of the victims, the grief they carry, the long road to healing is on. The sources don't go into detail about their stories, but I think it's important to acknowledge the immense pain and suffering they endure.
It's a reminder that the ripple effects of this event are still being felt today, years later. And that takes us back to the question that keeps coming up. How do we prevent something like this from happening again?
Right. This event reignited the debate about gun control, which we talked about earlier. There were renewed calls for stricter laws, but also strong pushback from those who see any attempt at gun control as an infringement on their rights.
It's a debate that's been going on for decades in this country, but after each tragedy, it seems to become even more heated, more polarized.
It's a complex issue with strong opinions on both sides. Those advocating for stricter gun control point to the ease with which Betts obtained his weapon, despite his history of red flags. They argue for universal background checks, bans on assault weapons, and red flag laws which allow temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others.
But those on the other side argue that taking away guns isn't the answer. What are their main arguments? So they believe that stricter gun control laws won't actually stop criminals,
Right.
that it's more about protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens.
Exactly. They argue that the focus should be on addressing the root causes of violence. Things like mental health issues, societal breakdown, and the glorification of violence in media. They believe that stricter gun control laws would only punish responsible gun owners while doing little to prevent those who are determined to commit violence from obtaining firearms.
It's a tough conversation to have, and it's one that often gets overshadowed by grief and anger in the aftermath of these tragedies. But I think it's important to try to understand both sides of the argument.
I agree. And I think it's also important to remember that there's no single solution, no magic wand we can wave to make this problem disappear. It's going to require a multifaceted approach, one that addresses mental health, responsible gun ownership, and the cultural factors that contribute to violence.
You've mentioned mental health a few times now. It seems like after every mass shooting, there's a rush to label the shooter as mentally ill. But is that always accurate? And even if it is, does it excuse their actions?
Those are really important questions, and it's crucial to understand that mental illness is not a one-size-fits-all explanation for violence. There's a huge range of mental health conditions, and having a diagnosis doesn't automatically make someone dangerous.
So we can't just assume that every mass shooter is mentally ill.
Exactly, and in fact, studies have shown that people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, using mental illness as a scapegoat for these tragedies.
Yeah.
Only perpetuates stigma and prevents people from seeking the help they need.
It seems like we need to be careful about not oversimplifying the issue. Mental health might be a factor in some cases, but it's not the whole story.
Right, and focusing solely on mental illness distracts us from addressing those other contributing factors we talked about.
Yeah.
Easy access to firearms, the glorification of violence, the lack of adequate mental health resources. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to shift the conversation from blame to understanding. Instead of asking, what's wrong with these people? We should be asking, what went wrong in the system that allowed this to happen?
I think that's a crucial shift in perspective. It's about moving beyond the individual and looking at the bigger picture, the societal and cultural forces that contribute to violence.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Dayton shooting, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will remember? What's the so what of all this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that these tragedies, while horrific, can also be catalysts for change. They can force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. They can spark conversations and inspire action.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by the tragedy, we can channel that energy into making a difference.
Absolutely, whether it's advocating for policy changes, supporting mental health initiatives, or simply having open and honest conversations with friends and family about these issues. We can all play a role in creating a safer and more compassionate world.
I think it's also a reminder to be more aware of the people around us, to look for warning signs, to offer support to those who are struggling, and to create a culture where seeking help is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Couldn't agree more. We need to foster a sense of community where people feel connected and supported, where they know they can reach out for help without fear of judgment.
It's a powerful message of hope and resilience, and it's a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there's always light to be found.
Exactly. We can choose to be overwhelmed by the darkness, or we can choose to be the light. We can choose to be part of the solution.
To our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Dayton shooting. We know it's a heavy topic, but we believe it's an important one to explore.
And remember, even though we've reached the end of this deep dive, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a world where these tragedies are less likely to occur.
Beautifully said. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.